Good evening, everybody. Red light?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll start again. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to part 6 of Finding Your Path, Mesilat Yesharim. As we said before, hopefully every section, every episode, I think they call them, of our talk should be self-contained to a certain extent. Obviously, it's better if you have the preceding elements, but hopefully you'll get something out of even if you just watch one of the episodes. Last week we finished off just before the end of the first parak chapter, the Mesilat Yesharim, which is, he calls the B'vo'or klal chovas ha'odam ba'olamoi, the explanation of the generality of the scope, so to speak, of a person's obligations in this world. We spoke in previous weeks about the difference between rights and obligations. We're coming to the end now of this particular section, his introduction, where basically he outlines the fact that a person is put in this world only as a prelude, as a vestibule to the next world. The next world is the place which is prepared for a person, where the essential pleasure for which man was created for, which is to be close to Hashem, is enjoyed. And then he sums up here at the end, we're right at the last paragraph, Hinei acha sheyodu v'yizboreh etzleinu amitas klal zeh. Once we've clarified that, we've made clear the truth of this principle, the principles that we've just mentioned above, that a person is created for a station principle in the world to come, and we have, and using the expression of that we know and it's become clarified. So again, it's interesting, just as he was at the beginning of his introduction, he uses these two words. The person has to yoda, yizborer, and he has to know. He has to know and he has to clarify. So ostensibly these two words are, the second one's redundant. They're both saying the same thing. After a person yodanu, that we know, etzleinu, and it's clarified, yizborer etzleinu, amitas haklal hazeh, exactly what it is that a person is supposed to be doing in this world. So why does he repeat? Why does he say it in two ways? After that we know and it's clear, it's barur. So we mentioned an idea at the beginning of the book, which I'll say again briefly now, which is that a person really lives in two mindscapes. There's what I would call yediyah, which is intellectual knowledge, and there's something which is called, he says it slightly different at the beginning. He says, Sheyizborer v'yis ames. Here he says, Sheyodanu v'yizborer. So, maybe we could say the same idea, that there's two kinds of knowledge. There's a knowledge which is intellectual, and there's a knowledge which is what I call living inside an emotional reality. To be mit-amet, to make something true. Meaning, somebody can hold intellectual ideas in his head without them necessarily affecting him. A person can come to Osameach and he can listen to some very interesting lectures, can sit and listen to Rabbi Gottlieb telling him about the historical verification of the Torah. But he can go, that's very interesting, and God forbid he can get in his car and drive off to the nearest McDonald's. What a person has to do, is required to do, is to take his knowledge and to convert it into an emotional reality, that it's true, it's emes, it's emet, that is not just something intellectually which is intellectually valid, but that's how I see my life. That is the space, the world space, the mind space in which I'm living. So, he finishes similar lashon. I just actually noticed he says it slightly differently, but the same idea I think is true. The repetition of these two words are that hinei acher sheyodanu v'yizborer. Once we know and we've made clear, we've intellectually explored, and we've also achieved, as we said again at the beginning, that emunah is not something which is like on or off. It's not like a switch. You either believe or you don't believe. Emunah is more like a rheostat, a dimmer. It gets dimmed up and dimmed down. And also, very importantly, to realize that emunah is not something necessarily intellectual. It's a midah. I'm not saying it's anti-intellectual, but really that's the second part of what we're talking about. It's something which is part of your midot, a part of who you are, part of your emotional reality, your emotional landscape. Meaning as follows. Let's take, for example, I think we used the example before, you'll forgive me, but the idea of kas, anger. Now, a person intellectually can understand that to be an angry person is a very bad thing indeed. But that's not going to stop him being a kason, being an angry person, unless he works on that midah, and unless he takes positive steps to examine the fact that he's an angry person and to figure out, and there are steps for doing this, of controlling his anger, of dominating his anger. In other words, kas is a midah, and a person, if he has that midah, he can make that midah stronger, he can become more angry, or he can be less angry. So similarly, emunah is a midah. Emunah, belief in God, is a midah, is a how's it called in English, is a character trait. After the intellectual process has been completed, it's into the realm of character traits. And of course, a character trait can be strengthened or weakened. A person can increase his emunah, and a person can decrease his emunah. Events come to a person's life which increases emunah, and they can decrease his emunah. I think it was Rabbi, I forget who said it, but talking about the Holocaust, that nobody came out of the camps unchanged. It either strengthened your faith or it destroyed your faith. Emunah is something which is varying all the time. It's like a graph which is going up and down in all of us, from the very greatest Jew to the very least of us. Maybe a Jew on a very low level of emunah, but that doesn't mean that level will stay. That it'll peak. He'll rise up, and even a great godel will have his ups and downs. He'll have his tests. Moshe Rabbeinu, we saw, has his tests. He came to Hashem and he complained 2 parshas ago. Lama Hirosa, why are you doing this bad stuff to the Jewish people? Why did you send me here to Paro? Ever since I came here, it's just been worse and worse for them. How could Moshe question HaKadosh Baruch Hu? The answer is that a person's emunah is not something static, it's something dynamic, and it's something which is part of his personality. And because it's part of his personality, it's something which can be weakened or something can be strengthened. So that's what we say. The klal, the principle that we've been speaking about in this whole chapter, that a person, again, this idea that a person's born from olam haba, and that how does he now ascend this ladder? The Mesilat Yesharim, quite literally, is the path of the just, and we're going to see it is a path. It's a path, actually, it's maybe more precisely a staircase, an ascending staircase. But he's going to now go through the different stages. We now have to investigate al protov, its details. How does a person mount this ladder to become closer to Hashem, to fulfill the purpose of his creation? The fi madrigosehem, according to their levels, mitchilas hadava vad sofa, from its beginning to its end. Kamosh sidrom, as Rabbi Pinchas ben Yoer ordered them, b'ma mashalo, in a brisa. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yoer wrote a brisa about this. Sheiveu kva b'hakdamasenu, as we brought it already in the introduction. And the levels are zihirus, which is translated variously as watchfulness, carefulness, and that's what we're going to be speaking about tonight a little bit. Zrizus, being careful. Nikius, cleanliness. Precious, separation, separating oneself from things which are in essence permitted. Hatara, purity, each one going up one after the other. Hachasidus, which is not chasidus in the way maybe it's more typically understood nowadays. It's a level of moving beyond what is considered to be what's written in the Shulchan Aruch, so to speak, to move outside, to be beyond the norm of Jewish responsibility. Ha'anava, humility. It's interesting how far up the scale another comes, how difficult it is to achieve. Yiras hachet, fear of sin, which is not the same as yiras ha'onish, the fear of punishment. Yiras ha'onish is something which is, we'll see, is quite low down the ladder. It's the Rambam says it's really for only people on a lower level. Here it's a high level, right near the top. The yiras hachet means that if a person is scared of doing a sin because he understands that any small chet is going to distance himself from being close to Hashem, and that's something unacceptable in his eyes. He's scared of not the punishment for the chet, but the fact that the chet distances him from Hashem. Kedusha, holiness, and he doesn't go on to the last two steps, which he's not going to deal with this in this book, which is actually in the Brisa, which is Ruach HaKodesh, which is a kind of communication from Hashem. And the final step in the Brisa of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yoya is Tchias HaMeisim, which means that theoretically a person who's able to rise up all of these levels theoretically could revive the dead. He doesn't bring these last two levels because I just don't think practically it's shayach in his generation, and alachas kam v'kama all the more so in our generation. Let's start. So the first Perek Beis, chapter 2, Beur, clarification of the midah, character trait of zehirus. As we said before, zehirus means either watchfulness or carefulness. I would say, and maybe we'll start out with this, and I'm sure I'll mention it again, that if one wanted to sum up this entire section, zehirus, carefulness, watchfulness, with one word it would be think. Think. What are you going to think about? Let's see. Hineni nazirus hu sheyeh ha'adam nizhar b'ma'asav inyanov. A person has to be watchful. He has to superintend. He has to take notice, examine all the time what it is that he's doing. And he says here in the notes of Segel, excuse me, is that the nature of a person, we said this before, man is part animal, part angel. The natural animal part of a person is to, and I don't mean animal necessarily in animalistic, but okay, that's part of it, but the reflexive part of a person is to follow his nature. That's the hergel. Person, when left to himself, like an animal, will just go after his instinct. Because somebody who goes after his instinct, after his habituation, better than instinct, the things that he's habituated himself to do, he's walking in darkness. And somebody who walks in darkness, he's like a blind man, very important, walking in darkness. Now, this is an interesting marshal, because if you think about it, actually, let me just read the end of the paragraph, the way he says it. The person has to superintend, to watch over all of his actions, everything he's doing in a general way. He said this in the first paragraph in terms of, let's say, what's the word in English? Strategy, and also in tactically. He has to look at everything that he's doing from those 2 points of view. Examine every action that he does. And maybe I'll just put in here something very important that he's going to mention later on in this chapter. That, are there any misunderstandings here? Maybe it's a good idea we should bring some next time. I'll try and remember. It would be a help. No? Okay. Okay, so let's carry on in the meantime. He's going to mention that one of the things that stops a person thinking about what he's doing is that the Yetzer Hara constantly manages to find him things that he has to do. He has to take care of that, he has to take care of that. There's a problem with this, the car breaks down, he's got to worry about a living. There's so many things in a person's life that make it impossible for him to, as they say, cinematically pull back and look what's going on in his life. The Yetzer Hara deliberately throws up in our way, in our lives, all kinds of stuff that he has to take care of. And therefore doesn't leave him enough time to think about exactly what it is that he's doing. And that's the, so to speak, the hergel, that's the habituation. Person's habituated to do certain things and he just carries on like that. With the result that it's a very dangerous situation because he's not thinking and he's not examining whether those actions are actually what the Torah requires of him, what the Shulchan Aruch says. So one of the things I would suggest is that, maybe it's a bit premature to say this, but a person needs to take time. It's called hisbodedut. It doesn't have to be that you have to wander off into the fields. That's very nice if you can do that. But what it means is that a person has to set aside a certain time, and quite a good time to do it minimally is last thing before you go to sleep. Is you replay your day. You push the replay button, and from the moment you wake up, you think about what you did, and what was good about it, what wasn't so good about it. And this is a way of examining your actions to see if they are consonant with the demands of the Torah of a Jew. Because, as I said, there's so many life is so busy, and he says that a person who doesn't do this, a person who just follows his habituation, a person doesn't supervise his actions and his directions, in other words, what he's doing or where he's going, whether they are good or not. And of course, good or not really means that he has to understand halacha, or he has to have a rabbi. He has to know, are these actions which I'm doing, that's the way that I'm supposed to be, is that what the Torah demands of me? Why? Because he shouldn't abandon himself l'sakana ha'avdun chas v'chalila. Very strong words, because by not doing this, he is abandoning himself to possible death. Now, that death could be a punishment in this world, or it could be he's forfeiting some part of his olam haba, or maybe much of his olam haba. And he shouldn't go yelech b'malach hargolo, with the going of his habituation, ke'ive ba'afela, like a blind person in the dark. Now, if you think about this phrase, it's a rather strange phrase. A blind person in the dark. If he's blind, what do I care whether it's day or night? If he's blind, he'll bump into things and he can do himself damage. Somebody who doesn't open his eyes and think about where he's going spiritually, why wasn't it just enough for him to say he's a blind person in the dark?
Because other people can't help him.
Oh, excellent. The answer is that other people, at least if a blind person in the daylight can see the person's blind, he can guide him. He's not going to have that. That's exactly what we're saying. And something else he puts here in the notes is that yeah, that's basically what he says. So that is something which is doubly dangerous. This is something, if you think about it, which common sense obliges a person to perform this examination of his actions. And again, why doesn't he? Because the Yetzer Hara is keeping him busy with all kinds of other stuff. Seeing as a person has been given knowledge and discernment, knowledge of what's wrong and right, and discernment to be able to analyze what he's doing, which category that fits into. Lahatzil es atzmai, to save himself, and to flee from the destruction of this soul. How can it possibly be that he wishes to, so to speak, ignore, to blind his eyes, mehatzalasoi, from his being hatzala, from his rescuing himself from this danger. Ein lecha pechisus v'holelus ra mizeh vadai. Surely there is no greater lacking or foolishness than this evil, to do such a thing. Now, okay, I want to come back to a point, but let's carry on a little bit. Somebody who does this, hinehu pochus me'abahemos me'achayos asher betiv'om lishmo esna atzmam. Oh, I'm sorry, I remember the point that I want to bring out here. Ki achrei sheyesh la'odam das v'sekel lahatzil es atzmoi v'livroech me'avodon. Seeing as a person that has intellect and wisdom, discernment, to save himself and run away. He doesn't just say to save himself. He says to run away. In other words, this is something, a theme he's going to come back to later. It's not just good enough to stop doing what you're doing wrong, to save yourself from going over the cliff, but you have to run 50 miles in the other direction. Livroach, to run away. Run. So, he's saying that a person who doesn't do this is worse than an animal. Because an animal, even though an animal doesn't understand why something is dangerous, but he intuits that something is dangerous, and he doesn't stick around. So he's worse than an animal, a person who's been given not only an instinct for danger, which we all have, but also an understanding of why some particular thing is dangerous, and he still refuses to use that, and he blinds himself. So in a sense, he's worse than an animal. Kol v'alkein yivrachu. Therefore, a person again says it again. He should run away v'yanusu and flee. Mikol ma sheyireh lohem. So he's talking about the animals here, and therefore, animals will flee and run away and flee from anything which appears to them to be something which will be mazik them. But somebody, v'aholech ba'olamo b'li hisbonenus, a person who just goes through his world, through his life, without actually examining if the way he's going is good or evil, hinehu kasuma haholech al sfas hana'ah. He is like a blind person who is walking on the edge of a river, asher sekonosa vadai atzuma, where his danger is enormous, for also, and the evil that can be before him is krova mehatzaloso, is closer than his rescue. His demise is closer than his rescue. Again, he has this same idea that he's what you call it, he's a summa, blind person walking by the edge of the river. Now, anybody who walks right on the edge of a river or something that he can at the edge of a precipice, which is basically what he's saying, is in danger anyway. Now, all alachas kam v'kama, how much more so if this person is blind? So it's again this double idea of how he's stressing how dangerous this is. This is recklessness, what we would call. Ki ulam chesron hashmira mipnei ivaron hativi, o mipnei ivaron haratzoni, tahainu stimas ha'einayim, bevechira v'chefetz echotu. Because it doesn't really matter whether a person is lacking the guarding of himself because he's blind, naturally, or because he willfully, so to speak, blinds himself. Hear no evil, see no evil. Whether the eyes are closed naturally or whether he's voluntarily closing his eyes, it's the same. There's no difference to his danger. Just I'm going to see if he says something about this here.
That's the book Path of the Just, right?
Yeah. Now he has some notes in here which I just wanted to sing. Yeah, no, he doesn't really say more than that. Okay, so now, this is something which Hine Yirmiyahu hayo misoinein al roya b'nei doiroi mipnei hayosam naguim b'nega, with this flaw, Hamida Hazois, Shayu Ma'alim Einehem Ma'asehem Bli Shiyasimu Leiv Leros Ma'ahem. So he says this is exactly. Do you want to give it? It's Perik base. There's two kinds of. This is what you call it. Here we go. Because this is the beginning. He actually wrote this in two forms. He wrote it in one form, which is the form, the tradition, the classical form that we learn, and there's another form in the beginning here where it's as a question and answer, which in his day was a very common method of communicating ideas in the form of a conversation between the wise man and the student, or between the believer and the non-believer. In the Kuzari, right, he has the king and the rabbi. So here we go. Yeah. V'hina Yirmiyahu, right there. Okay. Shall I find it for you? Great. Okay. He's got an English translation here as well. I remember having this book many years ago.
Next Tuesday,
okay, B'ezrat Hashem. Here we go. Jeremiah. On the English side, Yirmiyah. So let's just read this paragraph. By the way, there's quite a lot of discrepancy individually between versions. Even the Hebrew versions have different words here and there. So, V'hina Yirmiyah, Jeremiah haya misoinein al roa. He, like a notion of aninus, he mourned on this evil of this weakness, roa, of the bnei doro, of his generation, mipnei hayosam naguim, because they were afflicted. Like nagoyim is how do you say when, like tsaras is blemished, is leprosy. They were affected by this spiritual disease, this spiritual disease, hamida, of this character trait, meaning what? Of ignoring what was going on in their lives. Shahayu ma'alimim, that they would blind themselves, so to speak. They would close their eyes from their actions. Beli sheyasimu leiv, without paying attention, liros ma'ahem, to see what they were doing. They were doing all kinds of evil, and they didn't pay attention to it. The nature of a person, as we said this before, is that a person there's something called cognitive dissonance in psychology, which basically, cognitive dissonance goes like this. A person wants consonance between his beliefs and his actions. Nobody likes to feel they're a bad person. Even, I think my Rebbe once told me, Al Capone, he wrote a letter just before he died saying that he was basically saying he was a great guy, and he was totally misunderstood. The nature of a person is that he wants to feel that he's a good person. So, for example, let's say an example of consonance, of cognitive dissonance would be that you buy a car. Now, this car looks great in the showroom. You drive it around town, and it's like a really stylish car, and you get lots of looks. But you take it out on the freeway, and it's about as comfortable as a board. It rattles all over the place. Now you've got a problem, because you can say that your belief is that a good car should travel comfortably on the highway. So you could either say, well, I bought a lemon, or you could say that, well, it doesn't, in other words, saying, by sort of owning up, Or you could play down the dissonant belief, which is saying what your belief that a good car should handle well on the highway. We're saying that's not really very important because I don't travel on the highway too often. But one way or another, a person actually has to believe that what he's doing is the right thing. So a person, when he tends to justify what he does because he says, well, look, I believe I'm a good person. Therefore, what I do must be good. Or if you won't take it that far, you'll say it's not so bad. It's not so bad. Why is it not so bad? And we can all find hundreds of extenuating circumstances. It's very difficult for us to come clean. And the nature of our life is that if we get into this hergel of, just not thinking about what we're doing. And actually, in the second chapter of this section, chapter 4, we'll come back to this idea. That the only way a person, I'll give you a preview on that. He's going to say at the beginning of the next chapter that a person, first of all, has to figure out what's good and bad. And then he has to figure out where his actions fit into that. So, that's I think the point is quite clearly that why do you need to start off with figure out what's good and bad? Just figure out whether what you're doing is good or bad. And the answer is no, because if you start off that way, the nature of a person believes that what he's doing is good. And therefore, inevitably he'll play down the dissonance between his actions and his beliefs by saying that altering his beliefs, it's much easier to alter your beliefs than your actions. But if a person, first of all, identifies in an objective way what is good and what is bad, well, that's nothing to do with me. This is an abstract conversation about the nature of good and the nature of evil. So if a person does that, if he identifies what is the true good that he should embrace, as he says later on, and the true evil that he should run away from with all of his might, and then, once we've had this conversation, gotcha, okay, you just said you know what's good, you know what's not. Now, let's have a look at your actions. If a person does that process, he's much more likely, it's not guaranteed, but it's much more likely, having already defined for himself, objectively, dispassionately, what is good and what is evil, and then he now faces himself with his own actions, he's got much more chance of being able to alter and come clean and say, yeah, it's not so good, got to change that, than the other way around where he just, let's sit back and think, what if I'm doing right or wrong? Much more difficult to come to an objective conclusion in that way. That's going to be in the next chapter. But right now he's saying that this is what Yirmiyahu was doing, that he was screaming at his generation. And he was saying, you're not paying attention. You're blinding yourself from your bad actions. And he said on them, it's a quote from Yirmiyahu, Va'ola alehem, Ein ish nicham al ra'asoi, leimo ma osisi, kulo shav b'merutzosam kasus shotev b'milchama. And he said about them, Ein ish, there is no one, is nicham, it's an interesting word, it's like to have nachama, is to have mercy, al ra'asoi. It's this poetic expression. Nobody is how does he translate it there? Nobody's having pity on his evil. Nobody's, does he?
How is it?
What does he say? He says, how does he translate nicham?
I cannot find exactly.
Oh, so let me show
No
the
one regrets his
regrets. Okay, yeah, okay. Nobody regrets his actions. Lay to say, me osisi, what have I done? Nobody is thinking about examining his actions. Kulo shav b'merutzosam kusus shotev b'milchama. All of them are running like a horse who's, pent up and foaming at the mouth in a battle. If you've ever looked at the horses, when they charge into battle, they've just become totally oblivious to what's going on. Everybody else is running to the left and to the right. Let's go. And that's what happens to a person. He gets caught up with the flow of his habituation. he's used to doing this, so he carries on doing it, and he carries on doing it, and he carries on doing it, and then, of course, the more he does it, the more natural it becomes. Chazal teaches that a person, if he does an Aveira, and he repeats it the second time, it becomes like mutter. It's right. The Gemara says it's not mutter. No, to him it becomes mutter. It's the Gemara in Gittin. Becomes because a person, again, I think part of it is this idea of cognitive dissonance, that a person likes to feel, we all like to feel, that we're good people, and therefore if I'm good, then what I do by definition is good. No. So a person therefore has to think, again coming back to our watchword, a person has to think. And we'll see that thinking gets done at different times. He has to think beforehand. And he has to think afterwards. And I saw here he has a very interesting idea. He says a note, and the call, and this is not, you won't have that there. The whole object of the Yetzer Hara is to blind a person, to blind the eyes of a person from what he's actually doing. He doesn't want a person to see what's going on. Okay, I think there's just one other nakuda I want to bring out.
You mentioned earlier a good point that emotions, like it's Hakara, like on this stage it just motivates the person, like with just all the emotions, so it blinds all the intelligence.
Right. That's the Yetzer Hara wants to just, as you say, to get a person just to get carried along with whatever he's doing, and to ignore what where he's going. So let's just finish this off. They're all running like horses. I'm sure we've all seen these pictures in these epic movies, all the great armies flying down with all the horses, everybody just charging. Hang on a second, where are you charging to? Huh?
Flooding. The translation will be like flooding.
He says flooding, shotev, it means flooding in the war. V'hainu sho'hiya rodfim, that is that they are pursuing, v'holchim v'remutzas hergelom, they are going in the, as we said, in the in the running of their habit and in their way, darkechem bli, without she'anichu zman, and that's the point I mentioned before, without giving themselves time, la'atzvam, to themselves, ledaktek, to examine, al ma'asim v'adrochim, on their actions and on their ways. And again, I want to say that actions are what you're doing right now, and drochim, ways, meaning where those actions will lead you to. V'nimsa shehem noflim, and it comes out that people like this who do this, who walk on the side of the river, blind man walking the side of the river, blind man in the dark, and why they blind? They blind, as he said, because there's no difference between physical, natural blindness, and the blindness which comes from failing to take the blinkers off your eyes. And it comes out that they fall into their evil without seeing, even noticing what's happening to them. All of a sudden, they're going to find themselves upstairs, and they're going to be so surprised because they didn't bother to think. This is a rather frightening idea, but what he's trying to get across here is that if a person does not consciously take time, that they didn't take the time for themselves. Whether, this is something I think that's the start of everything. A person has to examine his actions, and we're going to see examine his actions. Think about them before he does them. Think about them after he does them. And the reason why he has to think about them after he does his actions is because when the person is before he does something, he can find all the justifications in the world. The nature of physical pleasure is very short-lived, and so once he's satisfied whatever desire that he had, he can look back on that in a sense more objectively and think, was that a good idea or not? Probably wasn't. But the key is to think. That's the key of this chapter. The key of this chapter, and we'll leave it here for this week, is when we're talking about zihirus, which means watchfulness or carefulness. The active ingredient that is that think. Okay, so Hashem will carry on next week.